Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we have a very special guest. He is an author. His name is Ethan Nichtern. He's the senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition. He's the author of multiple books. One is The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path. Another one is One City, a declaration of interdependence. He's taught meditation and Buddhist studies in classes and retreats across the United States since 2002. And Ethan is based in New York City. He's got a new book, and that's the reason we have him on the show. Well, not just the only reason, but one of the reasons is he's got a new book out called The Dharma of the Princess Bride. And we want to talk to you today, Ethan. First of all, welcome to Personality Hacker. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Joel.
We want to talk about your new book. We want to talk about a little bit about Shambhala, and then maybe some of the takeaways, or at least one or two takeaways from your new book today on the show. So let's get into it. So let's start at the beginning here. Shambhala. Okay, this is a meditation practice, right? I'm gonna come from a beginner's mind and ask you the questions about this. Give me the 2-minute elevator pitch. What is Shambhala? Why are you doing this? What is this thing you're doing in your life?
Why are you doing this? That's something I have asked a lot. Well, Shambhala is a derivative, you could say, a very westernized derivative of Tibetan Buddhism. So obviously that's a tradition that uses meditation and study of the mind at the center of all of its practices. There's lots of different meditation traditions. There's lots of different Buddhist meditation traditions. Tibetan Buddhism tends to be, you could say, one of the more diverse in terms of the different types of meditation methods or tools that are used in terms of mindfulness, concentration practice, loving kindness, compassion meditations, visualization practices, etc. Shambhala was founded by a Tibetan man named Chogyam Trungpa, who came to the West after the full communist invasion of Tibet in 1959 and came to North America in 1970. And he really wanted to create a form of those practices that really related to life in the world and the sort of bravery and confidence to be awake in the world and all of the difficulties of personal relationships and social engagement and creative practice. And so he named this tradition, which had been sort of a mythology in Tibet, after this mythology of basically an enlightened society that had existed in Tibetan folklore. So Shambhala uses a lot of the Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices and ethics and psychological and philosophical teachings, but with the expressed intent of helping to create awake or enlightened society. So it's really a tradition of meditation practice for people who don't want to leave the world behind, and sort of the union of bringing spirituality into everyday life in the world to make our own life better, be more present in life, be more mindful, but also to create social systems that are compassionate and helpful. So I hope that was a good elevator pitch.
Yeah.
That was a great elevator pitch. Okay, when I hear the word meditation, I think a lot of people too have this image of, a Buddhist monk or someone going up on a hill, getting away from everybody, or even a Western person, in the United States or Canada or somewhere in the West, in Europe, whatever, going in the woods, renting a cabin for 7 days and spending time alone, away from it all. It's almost like this escapist picture we have about meditation, at least from my standpoint. And I think what most people tend to report when they hear about meditation, that they're not familiar with it, it's this idea of escaping something, or it's going somewhere else, it's going within, it's getting away from the real world. And what I picked up on what you're saying is that's not the tradition of Shambhala. That's really not in other words, the point is to have a practice where you're mindful and you're present and you're able to be with yourself, but you're also not escaping from something. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's been interesting for me. I grew up, both of my parents were students of the founder of this tradition, and I grew up as a Buddhist kid, but grew up in New York City. So it was an interesting balance. And just to see the last 20 years, and especially the last 5 years, and especially the last few years, how theoretically popular meditation has become in the United States, in the Western world. I joke in my last book, The Road Home, that meditation has become the thing that we're all happy that other people do. that a lot of times when people, I mentioned that my mother, who grew up in a small town in Arkansas, in the early 1970s, like her telling her parents, I'm going to study Tibetan Buddhism and meditate, that must have been a much more difficult conversation than whenever I tell anybody that I'm a meditation teacher and study Buddhism and teach Shambhala. The response I get is like, that is so cool. I wish I could do that. I wish I could meditate. And it's interesting because there's this, I think, bias or this thought that meditation is getting away from the world and kind of going to some mental oasis and shutting off your mind. And I think that's why a lot of people give up on it. A lot of people try it and then say, I can't do it, because your mind does not shut off. You have thoughts, you have emotions, you have perceptions, you have memories, you have to-do lists, you have fantasies, etc. And so, in the words of the founder of the Shambhala tradition, Chogyam Trungpa, he said the purpose of meditation is to make friends with yourself. And I think that's just a really beautiful way of thinking about it. Updating that for the Facebook era, I sometimes say meditation is about accepting your own friend request.
Yeah.
And which means it's a real person and there's a lot going on, and you're getting to know your thoughts and your reactions and your physical experiences and your creative impulses and your biases, and you're actually befriending those. And so I think that's a much better way to look at it, that leads to a lot more longevity in practice. Like, this is actually time spent with a dear friend, which is you, rather than I'm going to go into like some oasis, shut off the mind, sort of like some kind of mental massage. And then I don't know what people think happens after that. Maybe they just think their mind is going to shut off permanently, which is a weird kind of thing to strive for. But I think it's much better to look at practice as a way to really know who you are and be comfortable with everything that your mind throws at you. Especially, I was just talking to a psychologist who's a neuroscientist. I've heard this, the estimate is that we have somewhere between 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts per day. So, I mean, that's a lot. And it would be a lot better to be able to just deal with those thoughts and deal with having a space of awareness where we're compassionate towards ourselves, friendly towards ourselves, and friendly towards others than trying to get away from it all. Because in my experience, you can't really get away from your own mind.
Yeah. I think I read someplace recently that said that meditation is becoming what jogging or running was in like the 70s or 80s, where there was a time period where it was really rare for people to run, but now it's kind of expected that you do. And if you don't, you feel like you have to make excuses for it. But most people still don't, because it's really hard. And meditation is becoming like that. It's like, it's one of those things where if you don't meditate, it's almost like we're getting to a place where we feel like we have to make excuses for it. But I think that as a tool, I think that people are still pretty unsure of how to tap into it. Like, where do you even start and how do you begin? Do I have to go to a meditation center? Do I have to learn it technically? Can I pick up a book? Or which style do I use? Which style is right for me? I think there's an expectation, like you said, that it's good if everybody else meditates because they'll show up as a better person, but I'm not really 100% sure how to navigate the space for myself, even though I'm starting to think it's an expectation.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I encounter, there's a lot of embarrassment, that when you really actually do, some of the people who are most embarrassed when they meditate actually are psychotherapists. These are the supposed, and I've had great help in my own life from working with a psychotherapist, but these are the people who are supposedly the experts of the mind. And for a psychotherapist to admit, I sat for 10 minutes and I was incredibly uncomfortable with myself, that could damage your professional reputation, So I think we have this cultural embarrassment about having a mind. And I think a lot of, historically, we learn about a theoretical mind, or we learn about other people's minds, or we learn about, in terms of neuroscience, like we learn about the brain as this sort of abstract biochemical or neuroscientific space. And just to actually say, I have a mind, I have thoughts, I have emotions, and I'm going to become more aware of that and use some techniques to get to know it better. I think it's a big step, because in some ways it's like going back to kindergarten as a grown-up who, you know, may have even like a PhD in something, and you have to say, I'm going to go back to kindergarten with my own mind. I never actually learned how to sit with myself for 10 minutes. And so I think it's a humbling step for a lot of people. There's lots of ways to get started. There's great apps, you know, going to a center is always good because you get to hang out with other people who also kind of can't stand themselves, you know, but are basically good people too. And you learn that the teachers are not idols. They're just people who have worked with these tools more frequently for a longer period of time. And so I think community is really helpful and really demystifying. There's great books, you know, that are beginning guide to mindfulness, but I do think that there's lots of ways to dive in, and the only way to do it is just do it. And the more you just take the approach that it's not about shutting anything off or making anything stop happening, but you say, I'm going to just really spend some time with myself using these techniques, I think it's going to be helpful. And that's why in my new book, you know, which is a little bit of a cultural and spiritual and relational mashup, I really wanted to expand on this metaphor of making friends with yourself. Like, let's look at your mind as if it's like a movie theater, you know, and you want to get to know the characters in the movie. And that can create a more playful space for getting to know ourselves rather than it having to be like running laps at the, you know, in a pool or at the gym. It doesn't have to be so grueling. It can be more curiosity based and more playful.
So I remember, let's talk about the book for a second. I remember as a little kid, after the movie, The Princess Bride came out, I never saw it in the theater, but I did get to see it on video within the year. You know, back in the day, after a movie came out, it'd come out on VHS, you'd rent it, or Betamax, you'd rent one of those versions, whatever you had in your home. You'd watch the movie. And I remember watching that movie and thinking, wow, this is a really interesting, different movie than most movies. Like, this has a lot of theme. Like, even as a little kid, I realized there's something to this movie that's just different. It's unique. It's interesting. And it's something you almost want to go back and watch again and again. In fact, you referenced that in your book. It captured your imagination too. And you've watched it a lot of times. And now you've written a book, basically taking some of the disciplines that you've been using for years, and you've combined them. You've merged them with a pop culture. And this, again, it's around 30 years old now, right? So this is not a new movie, but it's still kind of in our public consciousness. It's something that's kind of got its hooks in us as people, I think, at least in the West here. Unpack that a little bit. Give me the little bit of the background, the story of where you got the idea of merging these two things. I know you talk about it in the book, but maybe just, again, kind of quickly summarize some of the thoughts around that. And let me know what your thoughts are on that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I have one friend who did a meditation teacher training program with me, and when I told her I was writing this book, The Dharma, the Princess Bride, she said, "Well, you really do use like lines from that movie a fair amount when you teach, so I'm looking forward to seeing them all in the same place." But really what this book is about is I wanted to write a book about relationships. You know, my last book was really kind of an overview of the Buddhist teachings from the Shambhala standpoint, the road home. And I wanted to go more into relationships, but I wanted to write it not in like a pedagogical or like, here's what I know about relationships or here's what Buddhism says about relationships space, but really in a way that could sort of allow me to just share my experience trying to be a mindful person and having all the struggles with relationships. And I also wanted to bring in something that acknowledged that our spiritual lives always has a kind of cultural context and certain cultural narratives. And, you know, for those of us who grew up Generation X, you know, I was 9 years old when The Princess Bride came out. I think the romantic comedy and the fairy tale and the deconstruction of those are, you know, really big sort of narratives against which to set our path to try to understand ourselves in relationships to others. So, you know, it turned out to be this like just interesting mashup of wanting to write about 30 years of trying to learn about relationships, friendship, romance, and family, 30 years of studying Buddhism and trying to practice meditation increasingly, and, you know, 30 years of loving this kind of pop cultural icon narrative. And, you know, with The Princess Bride specifically, what I think is so brilliant about it, actually from a Buddhist standpoint, I don't think it's, you know, it's not, there's no meditation in it. although I did get to talk to Mandy Patinkin about it, and he is a meditator now, and identifies as a Buddhist. So there are some meditative connections with the stars of the movie. But I think what's so amazing about this is it's a fairy tale, but it's kind of a deconstructed fairy tale. It's a fairy tale that sort of knows that we don't believe in fairy tales. And, there's a lot of things in the postmodern contemporary world that kind of deconstruct a narrative. And this is a lot about what I think Buddhist meditation is about, is sort of seeing a storyline or a fixed narrative that we're living by and unraveling it a little bit, letting go of the narrative. And a lot of things in contemporary culture, try to deconstruct storylines or deconstruct narratives. But the thing that I think is so brilliant about Princess Bride is it deconstructs a fairy tale narrative, but it does it in a really optimistic way. It doesn't do it to make you more nihilistic or more negative. I'm thinking about it sort of in contrast with a deconstructed fairy tale like Game of Thrones, which is just, I'm sort of addicted to watching that one too, but it's kind of a slaughter fest. It's a very negative deconstruction for the most part. And The Princess Bride is all about true love. It's about letting go of your storyline or the fairy tale storyline, but then really embracing true love. So bringing those three together, just my personal story of over 30 years working with friendship, romance, and family, and loving a pop cultural narrative. And there were personal reasons that movie came into my life, and that year in my life was really, probably the most difficult year of my childhood. So there's a lot of sort of nostalgia in there too. But I do think that spiritual practitioners have to at least acknowledge, and if not just acknowledge, really embrace the culture that creates the context for whatever our spiritual practice is. And, even though I'm studying a tradition that started in ancient Iron Age India, I'm very much a person of the early 21st century in what I like to call the Kale Belt United States. You can, if you want to know what the Kale Belt is, I'd be happy to go into that too. But you really have to honor your place and time, and then that's going to inform your spiritual path.
Yeah. Do you have a good sense of humor? Do you have a good sense of humor, Ethan?
I think if you ask certain people, they'd say yes. I think if you ask my wife, she'd say that she's heard most of my jokes before and kind of nod and,
my wife too,
without wanting to hurt my feelings. Yeah.
So,
I think I'm interested in humor,
okay.
And I think it's a really important part of a spiritual path, I think.
And that's, I guess the reason I asked that is it seems like when I'm around people that are, not everybody, but some spiritual teachers tend to, it feels like, and I don't know, this is anecdotal, it feels like humor and spiritual growth are incompatible in a lot of people's minds. Like whether it's the student or the teacher or whoever, or maybe it's just a public perception that I've picked up. It's almost like if you're going to be spiritual, you can't joke around. You can't tie into pop culture. You can't, it's almost like you transcend all of that. And that's what true spiritual stuff is, right? That's kind of the message I tend to get sometimes.
Yeah. Well, you have to be super serial.
Yeah. And what I'm getting from this is that's not actually, it's maybe even the reverse. It's the silly mistakes and the blunders and the comical nature of reality and the interesting stories and narratives that are pop culture that makes us human and makes us like spiritual in the nature of living our actual lives. Not, we're not in a position where we can go off and quote unquote be super spiritual in the woods alone somewhere or whatever. But it's this idea of being in the world, among the world, and still having the sense of humor and still having the daily struggles and still having those like ego triggers that's like, oh, that person got something better than I did or whatever. Like that's what's developing for me. And it's refreshing to talk to you in it. Like, again, I don't know you that well yet, but it feels like you've got a sense of, hey, yeah, I'm on a spiritual path, but I realize that I'm a real person. And like, I laugh at these jokes and this is funny and this is cool. And this is a narrative from the cultural tie-in here. And aren't we human? Don't we have to live in this reality? So let's embrace all aspects of it. That's what I hear coming from you. And am I accurate on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, there is this interesting sort of balance between taking life seriously and the urgency of waking up or being present, or figuring out what is really important in life. And then sort of having a sense of humor, not taking things too seriously, letting go. And it's interesting because Buddhism obviously starts with a very serious premise of like this really psychological existential premise of like, let's acknowledge that we are unhappy. Let's acknowledge that we fight against our own experience a lot of the time, maybe most of the time. Let's acknowledge that life is short. And it was when this tradition started, life was actually much shorter than it is now. But there's a sense of like, hey, like, stop distracting yourself, take life seriously. Let's really look at what's going on. And so it can lead you towards a real, a sense that like, I think that's one of the, problematic approaches for me to spiritual practices, like that a spiritual person like never laughs or never smiles. But I think the irony is that in order to really take things seriously, we have to start working with a playful attitude. Otherwise, we're really not going to have the stamina to want to be present or want to be on any spiritual path. And also, there's a lot of conundrums in our existence that are kind of like impossible to figure out. So I think sense of humor really leads us towards a kind of open-mindedness and an open-heartedness. Not the kind of sense of humor that's not aware of different modes of oppression or, misogyny or racism or homophobia or those things, but a sense of humor that really is trying to acknowledge the ironies in existence and open us up, which is, again, not to harp on it too much, but like, I think The Princess Bride does that magnificently. It's just, the whole thing is a joke. And then you realize that there's this incredibly tender moment at the end between grandfather and grandson. That's like the most serious, meaningful thing about devotion and love that you could ever really experience. And so that sort of balance between like, let's really take life seriously. Let's really look at the truth of suffering. Let's really look at how we fool ourselves and how insecure we get, how confused we get. That seriousness is mixed with like, if we're going to really make friends with ourselves, we need a really playful attitude. And there's going to be tons of apparent contradictions that need to be treated with a light touch and humor.
Yeah.
And I don't think I always get the balance perfectly, but, and that's another thing my wife notes and other friends note, like on social media, is like, wow, some people really take themselves way too seriously who comment on stuff you post or something like that. And I think that's true. I think sometimes spiritual practitioners are really holding ourselves to a very high standard that makes us like not that much fun at parties. But I also think there's a real, there's an ability to take life seriously and still have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Humor basically makes development sustainable. Because if you can't get to that space, then it's like, I guess for me personally, to take everything super serious is, it sounds like so much work. And to make development, growth, and, ego transcendence and meditation, and in order to make that a sustainable practice throughout my life, I think humor has had to be a part of that.
It's got to be fun, right?
Yeah, like I just wouldn't last. I think one of the things that in the introduction of the Dharma of the Princess Bride, you talk about one of the reasons why pop culture is so interesting to you is because it's like basically you're not resisting what is. Like you're acknowledging that, like you have a line where if a student is tired or angry, they're probably not going to fall asleep or comfort themselves with, like Buddhist lectures or yoga, sutras. They're more likely to quote The Matrix than they are, Rumi. And we're more likely to fall asleep to Netflix than we are to a tradition. So going down the road of pop culture and like basically being able to tease out the elements of enlightenment, should a piece of pop culture have a lot of elements of enlightenment, then let's not resist that. Let's go ahead and utilize the tools that pop culture can give us to help us reflect back to ourselves. And The Princess Bride, your subtitle is what the coolest fairy tale of our time can teach us about Buddhism and relationships, and how it really is a story about relationships. It's a story about a grandfather and a grandson, and it's a story about true love, and it's a story about friends and friendship. It's like it takes relationships and all of the most important relationships we have in our life, and like you mentioned, it's so tropey because it's trying to reflect back to us what our ideals are around this, but even when we have an idealism around what those relationships can look like what's the core truth of them, and how do we maintain those relationships despite our idealism and those tropes. And I think the word deconstructed fairy tale is such a great word for the movie. Is it okay if we enter a space of talking a little bit about something in the book that struck both Joel and I around this idea of making friends with yourself and recognizing that you need some alone time, but then at the same time recognizing that you're never truly alone?
Yeah, I think for me, this is, Ethan, this has been something, it's been a struggle for me my whole life. This idea of seeing myself as someone, and I think a lot of people struggle with this, okay. Like, am I okay as a person at the core of my being? And I grew up in a traditional Christian, upbringing, very traditional, very conservative, where the underwiring from the definition of who you are is broken and bad just because you exist. And you need this other entity or this God figure to basically save you from this brokenness. And that gets in your wiring as a kid. And I think there's a lot of people in the West that have that kind of wiring. I think it pervades our culture, even if you're not growing up in a household that's super religious or super Christian or super whatever. It's something that a lot of people carry with them. And it's been a struggle. I mean, it's reading it. I almost cried when I read the section about being alone with yourself and realizing that we are profoundly alone, and yet it's like coming to reconciliation with who we are also allows us to then love ourselves, have a good relationship with ourselves, and then have better relationships with other people. So I don't know if you want to speak to this at all, or from your perspective. I mean, I don't want to just go read your book out loud here on the air. I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of this. But man, the center point of this book for me personally has been that piece, because it's been such a struggle for me. And I think I'm still on that journey. And it's been a lot of hard-won turf for me personally to be okay with who I am. And I think I'm just coming down to a sense of self-ownership after years of working on this with a lot of concerted effort. So I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, that concept of this idea of making peace with yourself, being okay with yourself. You're okay as who you are. In that vein.
Well, thank you for that. And, I think it's like really this also gets to the sort of philosophical underpinnings of definitely the Shambhala tradition, but most Buddhist meditation traditions, which is that there's a view and an experience of human nature. In classic Buddhism, it's called Buddha nature or awakened nature. It's the idea that the basis of a human being is awake and compassionate. And in Shambhala, that's called basic goodness. That's our phrase for it. And I sort of don't want to say basic goodness is the exact opposite of original sin, but I sort of do want to exactly say that. It's the premise is that the nature of one's being is good, is complete, is whole, is awake, is sufficient, and so that's really good news. It's really incredibly good news. And so that when we meditate, it's actually, the idea is not to just sort of, trudge through the muck and slime of all of one's evil deeds. It's really to connect with the fact that we are good, and, I think we're terrified actually of ourselves on a certain level. I don't want to speak for others, but I think this is something I found. And, even growing up with Buddhist parents who were, I grew up, they were Jewish and Methodist, their upbringing respectively. But, I've been terrified of myself and just feeling like similarly, like there's something wrong, and so to be willing to spend time alone with ourselves there's just the beginning of a question, like maybe there's nothing wrong with me, and I think that trust is at the basis of the meditation tradition. Is like, maybe I'm spending time with a basically good, basically sane, basically wise, basically kind person. And, without that, to not be able to spend time with ourselves, we have to go into this space where we move into relationships, friendships, work relationships, romantic relationships, especially family relationships, especially, where we're always trying to prove or verify that we're not that bad, and that can be a really manipulative and confused way of relating to other people. The other thing about this is you really can't know another person's heart and mind. We can only really see our own experience directly. So the basic premise is that we do have to learn how to be alone with ourselves. And then we have to balance that work with being in relationship with others. But there is a sort of willingness to bravely face the fear of actually being alone with ourselves, with the support of practices. And so I think is at the heart of anybody's choice to meditate. It is a stress. It's been proven, very clearly to work really well with our nervous system, to develop great aspects of our biochemistry. But on a more existential level, there's a real willingness to be alone. And that is, it's necessary, otherwise we just go chasing after validation from other people. And that kind of leads us into really, usually really problematic habitual modes of relating to others.
Yeah.
This idea of goodness where you labeled as completeness, it's not like a necessary, like even in the book you talk about evaluative. It's not like good equals not bad. It's almost good is just, it is what is, and it is, whatever is must be good because it is, right? It's like this idea of acceptance of what is, in a sense of completeness or wholeness, or what is the nature of something that exists, is how I understand what you're writing in there.
Exactly. And, it is interesting because Chogyam Trungpa, when he chose that phrase, a lot of times people actually like the phrase Buddha nature or awakened nature because it's not so evaluative. But I think he was putting a little hidden riddle in the phrase basic goodness, because it does seem like it's a comparison to like that which is bad or that which is worse. But it's really hearkening to those moments in our experience where we just have an experience of appreciation, of gratitude, of connection, that's not comparing to something else, which is so weird. We live in a world where, I remember applying to colleges, and there's a ranking, U.S. News and World Report ranks the universities in the United States. And it's like, that's kind of weird, actually, in a sense, so we're not used to this idea of just like, did you enjoy learning? And it's like, yeah, it was basically good. I have such gratitude for that. So it's pointing to those moments of just appreciation without comparison. But the language is a little confusing because we usually think of it in comparison to like, oh, so it's better than, so if I'm basically good, I'm better than so-and-so, or I'm better than I used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that goes back to kind of how we understand almost everything with our nervous system. Like I read someplace that we don't actually experience temperature. We only experience change in temperature. And so we're almost kind of to some extent programmed to want to see everything in terms of contrast. But in reality, those are just nervous system responses, and that's not how we live our lives. We live our lives in our consciousness and unconsciousness, and like in something higher. So one thing that I thought was such a fascinating, I don't know, it was a way of talking about the human experience in the chapter Mercenaries or Besties, where you discuss how we basically what you're talking about now, which is that we have to learn to be alone. We have to actually accept that we are fundamentally alone. You even talk about it. It's like we're in this theater inside our minds, and we have a ticket for a private screening, and that all we can ever do is share aloneness. And you mentioned how culture is basically shared aloneness. It's like our approximation of being able to feel like we're connected with each other, but really we fundamentally are alone. But then later on, you talk about how when you start meditating, you realize that you actually aren't alone, because so many of the scripts running in our minds have been picked up from other people. In fact, you could argue all of them, because that's, one of my favorite writers says that the easiest way to be brainwashed is to be born, right? Like even learning language is a form of brainwashing. So all these scripts that run in our head are borrowed from others. So we are fundamentally alone, but then when we get to that space of aloneness, we realize, well, all these scripts are suggested from others. So we actually aren't ever quite alone. And I thought that was such an interesting sort of way of experiencing that we're the only ones who are experiencing what we're experiencing. Like you mentioned before, like we can only have a true experience through our own lenses. And that is a singular experience. But at the same time, we're picking up so much from the outside world that informs and influences us. All those people get inside of us. And so there's really no duality there. It's like, it's just kind of sort of an infinity symbol between us and others. And I'm not sure if I've pulled the heart of it out, but can you speak a little bit to that concept? Because I thought that was such a fascinating sort of non-dualistic way of seeing it.
Yeah. I mean, I think so, maybe the extrovert's bias, you could say, is to not want to be alone. And then I think you could also, and this is where I was coming from the book, is I think a lot of times, especially people who get into meditation, feel like, okay, I need to just be alone. I need to just take care of my mind. Nobody else is going to know me perfectly. Nobody else can help me. And those are great insights. But then I think we go a little too much into what I like to think of as like spiritual libertarian mode, like it's just me. And really, when you sit down to meditate, exactly as you're saying, you see that, as I say in the book, your sense of self is can only be personally experienced, but it's socially constructed, and that's why I think the notion of society and relationships, especially close relationships, is so important, because so much of the support for working with our own mind and so many of the scripts and narratives and storylines that we have running through our own mind come from social relationships. I mean, you could say, why do so many Western meditators experience, levels of sort of self-criticism or self-hatred even that aren't talked about in a lot of the Eastern texts? Well, we've never had this intense and this invasive of an advertising culture. So that has to have something to do with our own experience of aloneness. So, I think there's sort of, maybe this is oversimplified, but the extrovert needs to learn how to be alone with themselves, and the introvert needs to learn that their inner movie theater is also being influenced by relationship with others. So I mentioned the slogan from a T-shirt in the book, which is one of my favorite T-shirts. It's a T-shirt that says, "Introverts unite. We're here. We're uncomfortable, and we want to go home." And as if it's like a chant at a protest or political rally. And, I think that's, we do have to unite. And that's also, by the way, one of the things I love about The Princess Bride is it starts off being very much like this individual hero narrative of Wesley, the man in black, who's just this amazing, masterful swordsman and a fighter, etc. And you think he's just going to conquer the world, and it's going to be a very solitary narrative, but he can't do anything without his friends. So we're relying on each other constantly. So that balance, I think, if we can really understand the balance of aloneness and interdependence, I think that's actually one way of just defining enlightenment, is somebody who really can be with themselves and with other people simultaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ethan, I know we need to wrap up here really shortly. I want to ask you, you're in New York City, and I was in New York City a couple weeks ago, and I was surprised at how many, not that other cities don't have this, but just how many young people are in New York City. I mean, it's basically a young person city. I mean, there's obviously people that are older. There's a lot of 20-somethings, a lot of people that are just out of college, a lot of people starting their lives. And my expectation is you're exposed to a lot of young people. And we have a lot of, there might be a young person listening right now to this podcast. And, you've had a lot of experience, you've had a lot of wisdom. There's probably a young person listening right now who's interested in some of the stuff you're talking about. And my heart goes out for people that are just out of college, starting out their lives. I think there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of information pouring at them. And a lot of blame is getting tossed. You're lazy. It's every generation, right? I mean, obviously this happens, but in particular right now, it feels like the machine is really, really pushing down on the young people of the world right now in the West. And there's some unrest and there's some disillusionment and all of this. And I think a lot of young people, at that age, when I was that age, I was looking for myself, trying to find the path. I don't know if you had any kind of closing remarks of someone that might be young listening right now that you could say, listen, you're kind of in this, and I think your book talks a lot about some of this stuff about relationships, finding your way in relationships. But is there kind of like a last message? If this is we get shot into space tomorrow, is there like a last message for that young person listening right now, Ethan, that you would say, here's what you need to know, man, or here's what you need to know, girl. This is the thing you need to take away from this conversation for your emerging life that's happening right now.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. Thank you. I'm considered late Generation X. And a lot of the memoir parts of the book is about trying to be a spiritual practitioner through, being a 10-year-old and then teenager. And, I mentioned that I started meditating in high school, but it was the first time I got dumped in college. That's when I knew I was going to be a Buddhist. And being a 20-something and trying to figure out how to not be a sellout and have a genuine voice and a genuine presence in a world that often feels oppressive, or at least based on inauthenticity. And it is interesting in sort of media that the millennial generation is often kind of looked down upon, or there's all these stories about kind of shortcomings. And I think it's a little bit ridiculous, but I do think that it's if somebody's a teenager, especially 20-something, I think there's a real ability to both honor tradition and also find your own way. And I think, just speaking personally, that's what studying meditation and Buddhism has allowed. I don't think it's good to move through the world feeling like we made up all of our own ideas, because that's the other thing about interdependence. We don't make up anything. We inherit and repurpose and revitalize a lot of ideas and wisdom that have been existing before. So I think it's one of the things I realized, and luckily I had a tradition, which was also a very ancient tradition, but also a very modern and open tradition, that having a lineage, having traditions, studying what came before us is really important. And then at the same time, being unafraid to have one's own voice is really important. So, as a Buddhist teacher, as a 39-year-old who's technically a lineage holder of a Buddhist tradition, I think that notion of holding something traditional and at the same time being very of the moment it's a difficult balance, but it's something I try to embody and try to find my own balance with. And I think without it, I think there's a lot of folks, not just the millennial generation, Generation X, baby boomers, et cetera, who, when we don't have a kind of feeling of lineage or something that we belong to, that we feel part of, we feel like we're kind of floating on the wind a little bit. We feel unsupported. So that would be my advice, is if you can find, and it may take a while to find it, a balance between lineage and tradition and being your own self in the modern world. That's felt really both supportive and liberating for me. And we don't have to just throw out all traditions, because a lot of them have let us down. And we also don't have to be some kind of fundamentalist or feel like we have to disappear into a tradition. We can be ourselves and be part of a lineage at the same time. So that's what's coming up right now.
Awesome. Ethan, thank you so much for being on our podcast. We really appreciate you coming by. If somebody wants to look up more information about you, about Shambhala, just kind of go down that rabbit hole a little bit, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so Ethan Nichtern. .com, Nichtern.com, and Ethan Nichtern is my handle at all the social media places that a person might use. And in terms of getting more interested in Shambhala, definitely, I think if people wanted to read my, if you're not a Princess Bride fan, or you're not a fan of relationships, if you want to read The Road Home, that's a good introduction and overview of Buddhism from the Shambhala perspective. And there's a Shambhala center in pretty much every major city in North America. So that's another, you can just look it up on the internet. If you're in New York or another place that I go teach, please come say hi.
And I'm guessing there's a world, like there's others, we have a pretty big audience outside of the US too. There's places all over major cities in the world too.
Yes, all over Europe, and some in Asia, et cetera. But there's a lot of ways to connect online, and there's, even if it's not Shambhala, there's great meditation centers, so many places now.
Awesome.
So there's a lot of resources out there.
Great.
All right. We've been talking to Ethan Nichtern. His new book is The Dharma of the Princess Bride. Get yourself a copy. Giving a big plug for this, and check out what Ethan's all about, because I think he's got some good stuff. Thanks for being on the show today with us, Ethan. If you would like to leave a comment or ask a question about some of the stuff we talked about today, head over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment, ask a question directly below this show. And also, if you'd like to join a community of like minds, you can find us over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly magnanimous, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.